The nib of my fountain pen caught on the coarse fiber of the paper, sputtering a blot of black ink that looked too much like a shrapnel burst. I stared at it, this dark Rorschach test spreading across the field report, and wondered if my memory is playing tricks on me again. I am an old man now, and the years have a way of softening the edges of horror, filing them down until they are smooth enough to handle without cutting your hands. But I remember that blot. I remember the smell of the dugout, a subterranean cocktail of wet wool, stale tobacco smoke, and the distinct copper tang of unwashed men waiting to die. It was July 1943, somewhere near a place called Kursk, though the geography has long since blurred into a single, muddy smear in my mind. The Russians were out there, miles of them, dug into the earth like ticks, waiting for us to try and burn them out. I sat on a crate of ammunition, my back pressed against the weeping clay wall, trying to compose a lie. That was my trade, after all. I wasn't a soldier. Not really. I was a chronicler, a myth maker. My shoulder tab said, a title that felt heavy with irony in the claustrophobic dark. I looked down at the sentence I had just written. Tenuous. The words stared back at me, accusing. In Munich, sitting in my sun-drenched office with a view of the linden trees, tenuous was just a descriptor, a precise tool to convey a specific degree of fragility. But here, in the belly of the Eastern Front, tenuous was treason. It was a crack in the marble facade we were building for the people back home. I closed my eyes and tried to summon the ghost of that Munich office. I wanted to smell the fresh coffee and the crisp newsprint, to feel the smooth, polished wood of my desk. I wanted to be the man I was then, ambitious, fervent, believing that words were the bricks of history. I thought that if I arranged the sentences correctly, I could impose order on the chaos of the world. I thought I was a patriot. God, I was so young. 31 feels ancient when you are surrounded by boys who haven't yet learned to shave, but looking back, I was a child playing with fire. The memory of the sunlight faded, replaced by the flickering light of the kerosene lamp hissing above me. The shadows of the other men danced on the dirt walls, elongated and grotesque. They were sleeping, or pretending to. Some were writing letters they knew might never be read. I looked back at the paper. I took my pen and drew a thick black line through tenuous. I wrote steadfast above it. There, I had fixed the war. With a stroke of a pen, fear became resolve. Doubt became determination. I felt a familiar sickness in my gut, a nausea that had nothing to do with the dysentery plaguing the camp. It was the dissonance, the grinding friction between what my eyes saw and what my hand wrote. I was building a cathedral of lies, stone by stone, dispatch by dispatch, terrified that if I stopped, the whole structure would collapse and crush us all. The radio operator in the corner shifted, the headset clamped over his ears like a vice. The static hissed, a rhythmic wash of white noise that sounded like the sea we were so far away from. Then the voice cut through. It wasn't shouting. It was calm, almost bored. Citadel is a go. Repeat, Citadel is a go. The code word hung in the damp air. Operation Citadel, the greatest accumulation of armor the world had ever seen. The final gamble. I watched the faces of the men around me as the news rippled through the dugout. There was no cheering, no patriotic songs, just a collective, silent exhaling of breath, the sound of a condemned man accepting the noose. A young near the entrance checked his rifle bolt, the metallic slide sounding obscenely loud in the quiet. He looked at me, his eyes wide and glassy in the lamplight. He looked like he wanted to ask me something, perhaps to ask if the stories I wrote were true, if we were really invincible, if the superweapons promised by the Führer would save us. I looked away. I couldn't bear to lie to him with my mouth, only with my pen. I capped my pen and slid the notebook into my tunic pocket, right next to the heart that was beating too fast. I reached for my Leica. It was cold to the touch, a heavy, precision-engineered block of glass and metal. It was my shield. As long as I was looking through the viewfinder, I wasn't part of the war. I was an observer, a distinct entity, or so I told myself. I checked the film advance, the aperture ring. F8, be ready for anything. The silence that followed the radio call was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on our chests. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. I checked my watch. 3:30 hours. The darkness outside was absolute, a void swallowing the steppe. And then, the earth ceased to be solid. It didn't start with a sound. It started with a vibration that traveled up through the soles of my boots and rattled my teeth in my skull. The dirt ceiling of the dugout began to rain dust, coating my shoulders in a fine, gray powder. Then came the noise. It wasn't a series of explosions. It was a single, continuous roar, a tearing of the sky that defied description. Thousands of guns, ours and theirs, opening their throats at once. The air pressure in the dugout spiked, popping my ears. The lamp swung violently, casting wild, spinning shadows. I grabbed my helmet, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fasten the strap. This was it. The narrative was moving, and I had to chase it. I crawled out of the dugout and into the inferno. The transition from the subterranean gloom to the surface was blinding. Not from the sun, which hadn't yet risen, but from the muzzle flashes. The horizon was a strobing, convulsing line of fire. The noise was no longer a sound. It was a physical assault, a hammer beating against every inch of my skin. I tried to stand, but the ground was heaving like the deck of a ship in a storm. I stumbled toward the assembly area, clutching my camera to my chest, terrified a piece of shrapnel would shatter the lens. The neat, orderly columns I had written about in my dispatches were gone. In their place was a churning ocean of steel and men. Engines revved a deep, guttural growl that competed with the artillery. I saw the shapes of the tigers and the new panthers, massive and angular, lurching forward through the gloom. They looked like prehistoric beasts, monsters of our own making, belching blue smoke that stung the eyes and tasted of oil and death. I needed a vantage point. I needed to frame the might of the Reich. I scrambled up the side of a half-track, hauling myself onto the armor plating. My mentor, not a person, but a cold, detached voice in my head, took over. I found myself next to a young tank gunner. He couldn't have been more than 19. He was perched in the turret of a Panzer IV, staring ahead with a look of intense, fragile concentration. I raised my camera, framing him against the backdrop of the burning horizon. This was the image the editors in Berlin wanted. The Aryan warrior, stoic in the face of destiny. I snapped the shutter. The mechanical click was lost in the cacophony, but I felt it. A stolen moment. Right about us, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. He didn't look at me. He just kept staring into the fire. Tell them we're winning, I nodded. A lie of omission. I couldn't tell him that I had just rewritten his fear into steadfastness. I couldn't tell him that the sheer scale of the Soviet return fire suggested we were walking into a meat grinder. To my left, an SS officer stood in the open hatch of his command vehicle. He was calm, terrifyingly so. He held a pair of binoculars to his eyes, watching the destruction with the detached interest of a scientist observing a bacterial culture. He didn't flinch when a shell landed 50 meters away, showering us with clods of earth. He was the true believer, the man who had swallowed the poison whole and asked for seconds. I aimed my lens at him, but lowered it. He wasn't the story I wanted to tell. He was the story I was afraid of. The column began to move, a slow, grinding surge of metal. I jumped off the half-track and ran alongside, my boots sucking in the mud. I needed to be closer to the front. I needed to see the face of the enemy, or at least the face of our victory. We pushed into the salient. The landscape was a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite, so strong it tasted like sucking on a penny. We passed the first wrecks, Russian T-34s, burning with a fierce orange intensity. Good. This was good. I stopped to photograph a burning hulk, framing the black cross of a passing German tank in the foreground. Symbolism, dominance, but then the rhythm of the battle changed. It wasn't just the distant thunder of artillery anymore. It was the whip-crack of high-velocity anti-tank rounds passing close by. The whistle of mortars. The scream of men. We hit the minefields. The Lead Panther, one of the new invincible machines I had typed so many superlatives about, vanished in a cloud of dirt and black smoke. When the dust cleared, it was a broken toy, its track unspooled like a dead snake, its turret askew. The crew didn't get out. I froze. My training told me to document this, to show the sacrifice, but my finger wouldn't depress the shutter. This wasn't a heroic sacrifice. It was a waste, a mechanical failure or a tactical blunder. It didn't fit the narrative. I saw the young gunner's tank again. The Panzer IV I had stood beside moments ago. It was maneuvering desperately, trying to find cover where there was none. A hidden anti-tank gun, camouflaged in the tall rye grass, barked. A flash of light, blindingly bright, struck the Panzer's flank. I watched time slowing down to an agonizing crawl as the ammunition inside the tank cooked off. The turret popped into the air like a champagne cork, trailing a plume of fire. The boy who wanted me to write about him, he was gone, vaporized in a millisecond of physics and chemistry. I raised the camera. I had to. It was my duty. I looked through the viewfinder, trying to find focus, but my hands were shaking too violently. The image in the glass was a blur of fire and steel. I couldn't do it. I couldn't reduce that boy's death to a piece of propaganda. I lowered the camera, the strap digging into my neck. I scrambled into a ditch, pressing my face into the dirt, the taste of soil filling my mouth. From my worm's eye view, I watched the unraveling. It wasn't just one tank. It was dozens. The great armored fist of the Wehrmacht was smashing against a wall of iron and stubbornness it could not break. I saw the Panthers, the pride of our industry, faltering. Some were burning. Others sat motionless, plagued by mechanical ghosts, their engines dead. The Russian artillery was merciless, hammering the stalled columns with surgical precision. I looked at the notebook in my pocket, the one with the word steadfast written in fresh ink. It felt heavy like a stone. I looked out at the burning plain, at the smoke turning the morning sun into a bloody smear. The lens through which I had viewed the world, the lens of inevitable victory, of superior will, was cracked. I was no longer a writer chronicling a triumph. I was a witness to an execution. And as I watched the smoke rise from the grave of the III, Panzer Corps, I knew that no amount of ink could cover this up. The lie was dying out there in the tall grass, burning along with the boys I had sent to their deaths with my adjectives. The order to pull back didn't come as a shout, but as a whisper of collapse that rippled down the line. We flowed backward, a broken river of steel and flesh clogging the dust-choked roads of the steppe. The myth of invincibility did not just crack. It shattered under the pressure of a reality we had been forbidden to report. I sat in the back of an Opel Blitz, clutching my typewriter like a holy relic, though I knew it was nothing more than a mechanism for deceit. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and burning diesel. We stopped near a scorched grove of birch trees because the engine overheated and we needed water. I stumbled out, my legs numb, seeking a moment of stillness in the chaos. That is when I saw the black uniform. Immaculate, pressed, a stark, terrifying contrast to the gray rags of the infantry. An SS officer stood by a shallow ditch. 3 soldiers knelt before him. They were not cowards. They were boys hollowed out by 3 days of constant shelling, their eyes empty of everything but exhaustion. They had dropped their rifles to carry a wounded comrade. For this, they were branded defeatists. There was no trial, no reading of charges, just the sharp report of a Luger. 3 times, the bodies crumpled into the dirt, indistinguishable from the earth we claimed to be liberating. The silence that followed was louder than the artillery barrage on the horizon. The officer turned. He saw me. He saw the Leica hanging around my neck. He didn't holster his weapon. He pointed a gloved finger at the corpses. "Photograph them," he said. "Let the others see what happens to those who lose faith." I raised the camera. My hands shook just as they had with the tank, but this time fear steadied them. I framed the shot. I focused on the muddy boots, the stillness of death. I did not photograph the officer. I did not photograph the smoking gun. I photographed the consequence, leaving the cause in the shadows. I became an accomplice. The shutter clicked, and the sound felt like a second execution. Back in the truck, the driver shouted that we were moving. I sat with the typewriter on my knees. I had to file a dispatch, a report on enemy sabotage behind the lines. That was the official story. My fingers hovered over the keys. I could not write it. I could not turn those murdered boys into traitors. But I could not write the truths, or I would join them in the ditch. I typed, urgent request for supplies. I wrote about the need for winter coats, specifically 300 of them, a number that meant nothing to the quartermaster, but everything to the code we had established for friendly fire incidents. I buried the murder in a requisition form. I pulled the paper from the roller, the sound tearing at the silence. I handed it to the radio operator. He looked at me, tired and indifferent. He didn't know he was holding my death warrant if anyone bothered to check the cipher. The code was never broken, or perhaps in the avalanche of defeat that followed, no one cared enough to read it. I survived the retreat. I survived the encirclements. I survived the peace. Now, I sit in my apartment in Munich. The war is a museum exhibit. They interview me for documentaries. They ask about the strategy, the tanks, the mud. They want the grand narrative of the Eastern Front. I give them the dates. I give them the names of generals. But I never tell them about the Birch Grove. For 50 years, I have not seen the faces of the Russians I was supposed to hate. I see only those 3 German boys. They stare at me from the corners of my room. They ask why my camera was a weapon against them. They ask why my words did not save them. I was a journalist. My trade was truth. My tools were ink and paper. I believed I was capturing history, but I was merely curating a delusion. The most dangerous lies are not the ones we tell the enemy. They are the ones we tell ourselves to keep marching, to keep pulling the trigger, to keep typing. Propaganda does not just deceive the mind. It rots the soul of the nation that manufactures it. We poisoned our own well, and then we drank from it deeply. I look at my hands. They are spotted with age, shaking now not from fear, but from the frailty of time. I haven't touched a typewriter in decades. I cannot bear the sound of the keys. It reminds me too much of the mechanical rhythm of a lie taking shape. The machine is broken. The ribbon is dry. I spent my life planting seeds of glory, but I harvested only ash. My profession was to shed light, but I spent my life building a labyrinth of shadows. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.